On a blistering August morning into 16 BC, Rome marched with the largest army it had ever assembled, 8 legions moving like a living wall of bronze across the plains of Apulia. They believed victory was inevitable. They believed Hannibal was cornered. They believed numbers alone could crush fate. By nightfall, those beliefs would die with them. In just a few hours, 80,000 Romans would be trapped, suffocated, and cut down in the most perfect ambush the ancient world had ever seen. Rivers would turn red, commanders would vanish in the crush, and one man's brilliance would rewrite military history forever. The disaster at Cannae did not happen by chance. It was the result of 3 years of relentless marching, ruthless strategy, political arrogance, and a Carthaginian commander who understood Rome better than Rome understood itself. Hannibal Barca had crossed the Alps with an army held together by willpower, discipline, and a hatred forged in childhood. He had shattered Roman legions at Trebia and drowned entire armies in the fog of Lake Trasimene. Yet Rome still refused to believe he could threaten the very heart of the Republic. So into 16 BC, desperate for redemption, humiliated by defeat, and convinced that sheer numbers could force destiny to bend, Rome raised the largest army in its history. Senators promised victory. Commanders promised glory. Citizens promised revenge. None realized they were marching straight into the deadliest trap ever conceived on ancient soil. By the end of this story, you will understand how Hannibal manipulated terrain, psychology, Roman pride, and the very shape of battle to engineer a massacre so complete that it echoed through history for centuries. If you're ready to witness the most devastating one-day slaughter the ancient world ever recorded, stay with this video, and let's step onto the killing fields of Cannae. Long before the dust of Cannae rose into the August sky, the road to Rome's greatest disaster began with a boy standing before a sacred altar in Carthage. Hannibal Barca was only 9 years old when his father, Hamilcar, the legendary commander of the First Punic War, placed his small hands upon a bronze sacrifice and made him swear an oath. The world would never forget, never to be a friend to Rome. That promise, whispered in childhood, would one day drown the plains of Italy in Roman blood. 2 decades later, the boy with fire in his eyes returned as a hardened soldier, heir to a legacy carved in loss and ambition. Carthage had been humiliated in the First Punic War, forced to surrender territory, silver, and pride. Hamilcar believed the future of Carthaginian power lay in Spain, and Hannibal carried that belief like a weapon. When he became commander at 26, he inherited not just an army, but a mission to restore his homeland's honor by breaking Rome's dominance. The spark of the Second Punic War ignited at Saguntum, a city allied with Rome. When Hannibal besieged it, Roman diplomats demanded his surrender. Hannibal's response was silence. His answer would be given on the battlefield. The campaign that followed defied imagination. Into 18 BC, Hannibal led an army of African spearmen, Iberian swordsmen, Celtic warriors, slingers, and the famed Numidian cavalry across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and toward the towering icy walls of the Alps. The journey was a nightmare of ambushes, snowstorms, starvation, and deadly cliffs. Nearly half his men perished frozen, crushed, or lost to hostile tribes. But what survived was a core of battle-hardened veterans united by one commander's unbreakable will. When these survivors descended into the Po Valley, Rome expected an exhausted force begging for mercy. What they found instead was a predator emerging from the mountains, hungry and ready to strike. The first lesson Rome learned came at the river Trebia. Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, eager for glory, blundered straight into Hannibal's trap. On a freezing December morning, the Romans were lured across an icy river, their armor soaked and limbs numb. As they struggled up the opposite bank, Hannibal unleashed his cavalry and a hidden force lying in wait behind the Roman lines. In hours, 20,000 Romans lay dead on the frozen mud. Survivors staggered back to Rome, speaking of an enemy who fought like he could see the future. But Trebia was only the beginning. In the spring of 17 BC, Hannibal struck again, this time at Lake Trasimene. Using morning fog and the narrow shoreline, he positioned his men along the surrounding hills, invisible to the advancing Roman column. When the signal was given, an avalanche of Carthaginian warriors crashed down on the trapped legions. It became the largest ambush in ancient history. 15,000 Romans died before they could even form a proper line. Their commander, Flaminius, was slain, his head later sent toward Carthage as a symbol of Hannibal's rising dominance. For the first time in living memory, Roman families saw smoke on the horizon from their own fields being burned by an enemy army. Refugees poured into the city. Senators argued. Mothers wept at temples. Rome had never faced a threat like this, an enemy who refused to fight on Roman terms and struck with terrifying precision. In desperation, Rome appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. His plan was simple but humiliating: avoid battle, shadow Hannibal's movements, cut supply lines, and wear him down slowly. It worked. Hannibal found himself stalked across Italy, denied the decisive engagement he craved. But Rome's pride would not tolerate caution. Citizens mocked Fabius as a coward. Young nobles sneered at his refusal to fight. Rome wanted victory, not patience. That frustration reached its peak into 16 BC. Two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, took command. Paulus favored caution, understanding the danger of underestimating Hannibal, but Varro, fiery and ambitious, promised the Roman people what they longed to hear. He would face Hannibal head on. He would end the war. He would erase the shame of Trebia and Trasimene in a single glorious battle. And when word reached Rome that Hannibal had seized the massive grain depot at Cannae, one of the most strategically important storehouses in southern Italy, the Senate finally snapped. They ordered the raising of the largest army Rome had ever fielded: 8 full legions, 8 allied legions, an unprecedented force exceeding 80,000 infantry and thousands of cavalry. As these legions assembled, the city buzzed with renewed confidence. Surely no foreign general with a patchwork army of mercenaries could stand against such overwhelming might. Veterans boasted of trophies they would take from Carthaginian corpses. Young recruits dreamed of returning to Roman triumph. But far to the south, near a quiet bend in the Aufidus River, Hannibal Barca was studying the terrain with a calm, almost eerie certainty. He knew Rome was coming. He knew they would come in numbers, and he knew exactly how he would destroy them. Not with strength, not with numbers, but with genius. As the Roman super army marched south through the suffocating heat of the Italian summer, the tension between its two commanders grew with every step. Rome's tradition of alternating command: one day Paulus, the next day Varro, had kept ambition in check for centuries. But facing Hannibal, a commander who exploited hesitation like a weapon, this divided leadership would prove disastrous. Paulus urged caution, warning that their enemy had never once fought a battle he did not control. Varro dismissed these concerns, calling Hannibal a cornered brigand with no reinforcements, no supply line, and no hope of escape. His speeches filled the ranks with confidence. He told them that numbers, not caution, would end this war. The legions cheered him, eager for redemption after years of humiliation. Paulus, however, saw what younger men could not. He studied Hannibal's previous victories with the eye of an experienced soldier. At Trebia and Trasimene, Rome's legions had not been defeated by superior weapons or strength, but by manipulation, terrain, timing, psychology, and deception. Hannibal turned Roman virtues into vulnerabilities, forcing them into battles they could not win. Paulus knew that their massive army was both their greatest advantage and their greatest liability. If placed correctly, it was unstoppable. But if compressed into the wrong ground, it could become a suffocating trap. That trap was already waiting for them. As the legions neared Cannae, the landscape changed. The great fortress of Cannae sat on a low hill overlooking the winding Aufidus River. The surrounding plains were flat, dusty, and exposed. To an untrained eye, it looked like perfect ground for Roman infantry to overwhelm a smaller enemy. To Hannibal, it looked like destiny. Below the hill, the Carthaginian army stood in formation, banners fluttering in the harsh summer wind. To Rome's scouts, it appeared shockingly small, almost laughable compared to the endless red line advancing toward them. But everything Hannibal placed on that field was deliberate. The ground was chosen. The wind was chosen. Even the dust itself would be a weapon. The Romans could see only what Hannibal wanted them to see. That night in the Roman camp, the large tents of the officer corps glowed with lamplight as maps were unrolled, and heated arguments erupted. Varro insisted on immediate battle, convinced that Hannibal was cornered and starving. Paulus argued that the open plains and swirling winds favored Hannibal's cavalry, not Rome's infantry. He warned that rushing into combat without understanding the terrain would be courting disaster. But Varro's confidence had already spread through the ranks. Senators' sons, eager for glory, echoed his calls for decisive action. Tribune after tribune spoke of honor, vengeance, and the humiliation Rome had endured. Paulus fought a losing battle against pride. Across the field, Hannibal's camp was calm. Spanish swordsmen sharpened their falcatas. Gauls painted their bodies in swirling blue. patterns meant to terrify their foes. Numidian horsemen checked their horses' hoofs and javelins with the ease of men born to fight on horseback. African spearmen Hannibal's veterans from Trebia and Trasimene polished their shields and adjusted Roman-style armor taken from fallen enemies. These men formed the backbone of his plan, the hidden blades waiting for the perfect moment. Hannibal moved among them, speaking to each contingent in their own language. He reminded the Gauls of Roman oppression beyond the Alps. He told the Spaniards of the silver Rome had stolen from their homeland. He promised the Africans riches when the Roman eagles fell. To each group, he gave a reason to fight, not with fear, but with purpose. His army was a mosaic of cultures, but their unity came from the man who commanded them. When he finally retired to his tent, his officers gathered around him like loyal wolves. There, under the quiet glow of oil lamps, Hannibal unfolded one of the most daring plans in military history. He explained it calmly, placing his weakest troops in the front to draw the Roman advance, instructing them to fall back slowly, deliberately, like a rope being pulled tight. His veteran Africans would wait on the flanks, invisible until the Romans pushed too deep. His cavalry would strike first, destroy the Roman horsemen, and then swing behind the legions, sealing their fate. If any part of the plan failed, the entire Carthaginian army would be destroyed. If executed perfectly, it would annihilate the greatest force Rome had ever assembled. Dawn arrived. Like the opening of a furnace, the August sun burned through the morning haze. As trumpets sounded in both camps, Roman soldiers tightened their armor straps, blessed their weapons, and formed their massive battle lines. Dust rose thick as smoke. The ground vibrated with the footsteps of 80,000 legionaries moving into position. Each soldier believed this day would redeem Rome's honor. On the opposite side, Hannibal climbed a small rise overlooking the plains. He looked across the field with the calm focus of a man who had already envisioned every movement that would unfold. Every rise in terrain, every turn of the wind, every inch of ground had been studied. Today, his childhood oath would be fulfilled not through brute force, but through intellect sharpened by years of war. The armies were in place. The trap was set. Rome was marching willingly into the jaws of genius. The first light of morning revealed two armies preparing for a day that would reshape the ancient world. As the sun rose higher, heat shimmered across the plains of Cannae, carrying dust that clung to armor and stung the eyes. Roman horns blared, signaling the start of formation. 80,000 legionaries moved like an iron tide, tightening their ranks under Varro's command. Their shields overlapped, their helmets gleamed, and every man believed he was moments away from crushing the upstart Carthaginian who had humiliated Rome for 3 years. Confidence pulsed through their lines like blood. Rome had come to end the war. Across the field, Hannibal watched quietly as his troops took their positions with disciplined efficiency. His center Gauls and Spaniards stepped forward under fluttering banners, their shields painted in bright patterns, their cries echoing defiantly across the flat earth. They were the weakest portion of his army, and Hannibal had placed them where the Roman hammer would fall hardest. Behind them, his African veterans waited on the flanks like coiled serpents. Their Roman-style armor gleamed dull bronze, making them appear as if they were simply more legionaries blending into the landscape. Only Hannibal and his officers understood the deadly purpose behind their placement. The battle opened not with infantry, but with a thunderous collision of cavalry. On Hannibal's left, his heavier Spanish and Celtic horsemen launched themselves at the Roman right flank. The charge struck with such violence that dust exploded upward in a thick cloud. Swords rang against shields, horses screamed, and men were thrown violently to the ground. The Romans, fewer in number and fighting on less agile mounts, struggled to withstand the assault. The Spaniards and Gauls fought with the ferocity of men defending their honor, hacking and slashing with curved blades that bit deep into Roman armor. On the opposite flank, Hannibal's Numidian cavalry surged forward. These riders, light, swift, and impossibly maneuverable, danced around their Roman opponents. They hurled javelins with deadly accuracy, darting in close and disappearing before the Romans could mount a counterattack. Their horses moved as if part of their riders' bodies, twisting and turning in patterns that made pursuit impossible. The Romans grew frustrated, swinging wildly at shadows while Numidian riders peppered them with relentless missile fire. As the cavalry clash unfolded on the wings, the Roman infantry began its advance. Like a solid wall of iron, the Hastati pressed forward, shields locked, gladi drawn. Behind them, the Principes marched in perfect discipline, their polished mail armor glinting with each step. Dust churned beneath tens of thousands of sandals. Centurions shouted commands that rippled through the ranks, tightening the formation even further. This was Rome at its most formidable and yielding, methodical, and convinced of inevitable victory. Hannibal's center braced for impact. The first collision struck with the force of a collapsing mountain. Roman shields slammed into Gaulish and Spanish bodies. Swords clanged against iron, spears snapped, and men tumbled backward from the sheer pressure of the Roman push. The air filled with cries of pain, battle shouts, and the relentless rhythm of metal meeting flesh. Dust rose in thick clouds, turning the battlefield into a swirling haze of chaos. To the Romans, everything looked exactly as they expected. Hannibal's center bent inward. The Gauls fought with wild bravery, but lacked the tight discipline of the Roman ranks. The Spaniards resisted fiercely, yet they, too, were pushed backward, step by step. A slow retreat began to form, one that appeared to be a collapse. Roman officers shouted triumphantly, urging their men forward. The legions responded with renewed determination, believing the enemy was finally breaking. But the backward movement was not panic, it was design. Hannibal had instructed his center to yield gradually, maintaining a controlled withdrawal. The Gauls and Spaniards stepped back, with calculated precision, pulling the Roman masses deeper into the bulge forming in the Carthaginian line. The Roman formation, so tightly packed, began to stretch and elongate. Men at the front pushed forward, unaware that their comrades behind them were being compressed in tighter and tighter ranks. The Roman line began to swell outward like a spear point, driving deeper into the Carthaginian center. The more they advanced, the narrower the space behind them became. Officers struggled to maintain formation, shouting above the rising din of combat. But momentum carried the legions onward. The belief that victory was within reach burned away both caution and awareness. And yet, this illusion of triumph was exactly what Hannibal wanted. On the flanks, his African infantry stood motionless, waiting. They had watched the Roman advance with the cold patience of predators, gripping their long spears and holding their shields firm. Their moment had not yet come. If they moved too early, the Romans might see the danger and pull back. If too late, the center might collapse completely. Every second hung on a knife's edge. Behind the Romans, the cavalry battles reached a turning point. On the right flank, Hannibal's heavy cavalry routed the Roman horsemen, driving them from the field into disorganized panic. On the left, the Numidians had effectively neutralized their opponents, preventing them from reinforcing the embattled Roman infantry. The Roman cavalry, meant to protect the wings of the legions, was gone. Now the trap could begin its slow, suffocating closure. The Romans, still believing they were grinding their enemy toward destruction, continued pressing into the shrinking pocket. But the field itself was changing around them. The bulging Carthaginian line was no longer a sign of weakness. It had become a crescent, its tips slowly sweeping inward. The jaws of Hannibal's masterpiece were beginning to close, and the Romans marched deeper into the mouth without realizing they were walking into annihilation. For nearly an hour, the Roman legions pressed deeper into the Carthaginian line, convinced they were grinding Hannibal's army toward collapse. Their shields were slick with sweat, their armor burned under the merciless sun, and dust clung to every inch of exposed skin. But still they pushed, shoulder against shoulder, driven forward by the roar of tens of thousands of voices urging victory. In their minds, the battle belonged to Rome. The Gauls and Spaniards, before them, were staggering, retreating, folding backward. What the Romans saw as weakness was the heartbeat of a trap. Hannibal watched the progression with calm precision. The center of his army had bent into the shape he had envisioned, a shallow crescent, bowing inward under Roman pressure. To his officers, he signaled patience. The Africans on each flank remained statues, spears angled downward, shields firm. They waited for the exact moment when the Roman formation had stretched so far into the bulging pocket that turning back would be impossible. Sweat dripped from their faces, but their discipline never wavered. They had followed Hannibal through the Alps, through the swamps of the Arno, and across 3 years of brutal campaigning. They trusted him now. Meanwhile, the Roman infantry grew increasingly disordered. Pushing into the narrowing space, they became compressed by their own numbers. The deeper they advanced, the more cramped the formation became. Soldiers found themselves unable to swing their swords properly, unable to step back, unable to breathe freely. Their famous discipline, normally Rome's greatest strength, began to choke them. The centurions at the rear shouted for spacing, but the surge of bodies from behind overwhelmed their commands. The Romans were becoming trapped by their own momentum. At last, Hannibal gave the signal. It was subtle, just a raised hand. a movement understood only by his veterans. The two African infantry blocks, fresh and unengaged, stepped forward in unison, with the precision of a closing gate. They pivoted inward, bronze shields slammed together, spears thrust forward. The Romans nearest the flanks, who had been focused entirely on the collapsing center, suddenly found armored Africans crashing into their exposed sides. The surprise was total. The Romans on the flanks staggered under the impact, their formation buckling. Cries of alarm spread through their ranks. Officers shouted for order, but the space was too tight, the pressure too immense. The crescent had become a ring. Inside the swelling circle, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers felt panic crawl into their bones. They tried to turn, but the press of bodies made even that impossible. Those at the back pushed forward, unaware of the danger. Those at the front were trapped between Hannibal's veterans and their own comrades. The air thickened with dust and heat. Men gasped for breath, their lungs burning, their helmets stifling. The tightly packed formation began to tremble, not from enemy attack, but from the rising dread that something had gone terribly, fatally wrong. And then, the final blow arrived on the Roman right flank. Hannibal's heavy cavalry had already routed the Roman horsemen. Instead of chasing them, the Carthaginian riders wheeled around and galloped behind the Roman infantry. Dust billowed behind them as they swept across the rear of the battlefield. Emerging through the haze, they slammed into the backs of the Roman formation like a hammer striking an anvil. Panic surged through the Roman ranks as men realized they were surrounded on all sides, front, flanks, and now the rear. There was no escape. This was the moment Hannibal had built the entire battle around. A double envelopment, the maneuver every military commander understood in theory, but none had ever executed on this scale. The Romans, 80,000 strong, were now trapped in a shrinking circle, a living mass with no room to maneuver, no room to breathe, no room to fight. Inside the encirclement, chaos erupted. Men screamed for space, for water, for help that could not reach them. They tried to lift their shields above their heads to protect themselves from javelins arcing down, but the crush of bodies made even that impossible. The heat turned the formation into an oven. Those who fell were trampled underfoot, crushed to death by the weight of their own comrades. The ground became slick with blood and dust, transforming the tightly packed mass into a suffocating nightmare. Hannibal's Africans advanced with cold precision, their spears thrust from all angles, striking men who couldn't raise their shields in time. The Gauls and Spaniards, exhausted but still fighting, pressed inward with renewed fury. The Numidian cavalry harassed the outer edges, ensuring no Roman could break through. The Carthaginian heavy cavalry attacked from the rear, cutting down officers, musicians, and standard bearers without signaling horns or visible standards. The Roman command structure dissolved. Paulus, trapped among the men, fought with grim determination, urging them to form a wedge and break toward the river. But the formation was too dense, too panicked, too crushed. His words were lost in the storm of shouts and steel. Varro, commanding on this day, barely escaped with a small group, riding desperately toward Venusia in shock and disbelief. For the vast majority of the Roman army, there was nowhere to run. The circle grew tighter with every passing minute. The press of bodies became so intense that men suffocated standing upright. Those who tried to swing their swords found their arms pinned. The legendary Roman discipline shattered completely. The legionaries were no longer fighting a battle, they were drowning in flesh, heat, and fear. As the sun climbed high over Cannae, the slaughter had only begun. Hannibal's masterpiece of encirclement was complete. What remained was the slow, methodical destruction of the largest army Rome had ever fielded, and there would be no mercy. The sun rose higher over the plains of Cannae, turning the battlefield into a vast furnace. Inside Hannibal's tightening ring, the Roman legions were no longer an army, they were a doomed mass fighting for the smallest breath of air. Dust turned the light into a red haze. Sweat poured into men's eyes. Every shout echoed back as a roar of sheer desperation. Tens of thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder so tightly that some suffocated standing upright, unable to lift their arms or raise their shields. The famed Roman discipline, usually Rome's greatest weapon, now trapped them in a cage from which no man could escape. The Carthaginian infantry, fresh and organized, tightened the noose with methodical precision. Hannibal's African veterans, their shields locked, and their spears thrusting in relentless rhythm, carved inward from both flanks. Their attacks were controlled, deliberate, and almost mechanical. They faced soldiers who could barely swing their swords, men whose arms were pinned by the crush of bodies around them. A legionary would raise his shield an inch only to be struck from behind by another desperate Roman trying to breathe. Panic spread as fast as blood. Every man inside the encirclement understood the truth. The army of Rome had been trapped like an animal. At the rear, the Carthaginian heavy cavalry continued their brutal work. They cut down the officials, centurions, and standard-bearers who tried in vain to restore order. With the signals silenced and the commanders dead or drowning in the human crush, the Roman legions fought blindly. The few officers still alive shouted commands no one could follow. Some urged their men to push toward the river. Others screamed for a wedge formation. But there was no room. The Romans were a single heaving mass, pressed tighter and tighter by the ring of steel around them. The Numidian cavalry circled the chaos like vultures, ensuring no Roman broke free. They hurled javelins into the packed ranks, each throw finding a target simply because the Romans stood so close together. Every man hit had no room to fall. He died upright, held in place by the weight of his comrades. The battlefield became a forest of bodies, living, dying, and dead, all locked together in a suffocating press. Hannibal's center. The Gauls and Spaniards who had retreated deliberately to form the trap, now surged forward with renewed fury. Though exhausted, they fought with the rage of men who had been hunted by Rome for generations. Curved falcatas rose and fell, their heavy blades cleaving through the compressed Roman ranks. The Gauls roared in triumph. The Spaniards shouted their war cries, and the already shrinking space inside the Roman formation collapsed further. Hour by hour, the slaughter intensified. By midday, the screams had grown muffled as dust coated every throat. The heat reached unbearable levels, baking the armored Romans like clay in an oven. Men collapsed from exhaustion, only to be trampled or crushed under the unbearable weight. Others begged the gods for mercy, calling out to Jupiter or Mars or their ancestors. But on this field, only one man held their fate, and he showed no hesitation. Hannibal had orchestrated the battle with chilling precision. Now he watched the final act unfold. His officers stood beside him, awed and horrified. This was not a victory. This was annihilation. No army in history had ever been destroyed so completely. Even Hannibal, hardened by a lifetime of war, later admitted the scale of the slaughter was beyond anything he had imagined. Yet he had no regret. Rome had invaded his homeland. This was retribution. By late afternoon, the Roman resistance had collapsed entirely. Men dropped their weapons and tried to claw through their own ranks, desperate to escape the ring tightening around them. But there was no escape. The Carthaginians kept advancing, step by step, closing the circle until the last pockets of resistance were smothered. Historians estimate that up to 50,000 Roman soldiers died at Cannae. Some accounts claim even more, up to 70,000, making it the deadliest single day in ancient military history. Nearly the entire Roman army was wiped out. 2 consuls had marched out to fight. One returned. Paulus died on the field, refusing to abandon his men. Varro, the commander of the day, escaped with a few hundred survivors, stunned and broken. The aftermath was a scene of unimaginable horror. Corpses lay piled in heaps taller than a man. Blood soaked the dry earth until it turned to mud. Weapons, armor, and broken standards littered the field. The stench of death hung heavy over the plains. Birds circled overhead, descending in dark swarms. Survivors described the battlefield as a harvest of corpses. Even hardened veterans of Hannibal's army walked in silence. For Rome, the shock was seismic. News of the disaster reached the city days later, carried by the few who had fled the slaughter. Families gathered in the streets, desperate for names. Mothers, wives, and children wept openly, fearing the worst. Entire generations had been wiped out. So many senators, aristocrats, and soldiers had died that the Republic struggled to fill the vacancies. Mass funerals were impossible. Rome declared days of mourning, and panic loomed over the city like a dark cloud. Many foreign allies abandoned Rome, believing the Republic was finished. Hannibal stood on the brink of total victory. Never again would Rome face such a catastrophe. Never again would Hannibal come so close to destroying one of the greatest empires in history. Cannae was not merely a battle, it was the day Rome almost died. When the shattered survivors of Cannae reached Rome, the city braced for a blow unlike any in its history. The gates opened not to welcome victorious legions, but to receive a handful of exhausted, dust-covered fugitives who carried nothing but terror in their eyes. Their words fell like stones upon the Senate. The greatest army Rome had ever assembled was gone. Tens of thousands lay dead on a distant plain. Consuls, senators, nobles, and veterans had been erased in a single afternoon. The Republic, so proud, so unshakable, stood on the brink of collapse. For a moment, silence hung over Rome like a shroud. Then panic erupted. Wailing filled the streets. Women tore their garments as they searched for the names of sons and husbands. Families crowded temples, begging the gods for mercy. Rumors spread like wildfire. Hannibal was marching toward the city, the enemy who had crushed Roman armies at Trebia, Trasimene. And now Cannae, surely he would come to finish the job. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. This decision remains one of the most debated mysteries in ancient military history. Many believed he had the power to strike at the heart of the Republic. His cavalry dominated Italy. His infantry had just dismantled Rome's greatest force. Allies across the peninsula waited to defect. And yet, Hannibal did not move against the capital. He paused. There were reasons: strategic, political, and logistical. His army, though victorious, was exhausted after hours of slaughter. They lacked the siege equipment needed to storm Rome's massive walls. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements from Carthage were uncertain. And Rome itself was not a city that surrendered easily. Its walls were high, its people stubborn, its spirit unbroken. But perhaps most importantly, Hannibal understood the difference between winning a battle and winning a war. Inside Rome, as grief threatened to smother the Republic, a remarkable thing happened. Instead of collapsing, Rome stood up. The Senate, still reeling from the losses, refused to negotiate. They declared mourning but forbade public displays of despair. They sent envoys to calm the Italian allies. They punished defeatism with death. And they turned to the one man whose strategy, once mocked, now seemed prophetic: Fabius Maximus, the delayer. His approach: avoid pitched battles, harass Hannibal, cut off his supplies, became Rome's new doctrine. The Republic reorganized its shattered forces. Young boys were drafted. Slaves were offered freedom if they agreed to fight. Even criminals were released from chains and handed shields. Rome raised new armies with a determination born of desperation. Across Italy, Hannibal's victory sent shockwaves. Several cities defected to him, believing Rome's end was near. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates. Greek colonies wavered. Even some Samnite and Bruttian tribes joined the Carthaginian cause. Hannibal's camp swelled with new allies, fresh supplies, and renewed confidence. Yet with every passing month, he faced the same problem. He was fighting in Italy, far from home, with an enemy who refused to die. Rome transformed Cannae from a wound into a weapon. They adapted their strategy. They studied Hannibal's tactics. They learned patience, something they had never considered a virtue. Instead of meeting Hannibal in direct battle, Roman commanders shadowed him, denying the Carthaginians the open plains needed for cavalry superiority. They cut off his food. They harassed his allies. They forced him into a war of attrition, a kind of war Rome could sustain, but Hannibal could not. Years passed. Hannibal roamed Italy undefeated, yet unable to deliver the final blow. The Romans slowly clawed back their influence, city by city. The tide turned when a young general named Scipio rose to prominence. He had studied Hannibal's methods with almost religious devotion. He understood mobility, deception, and the importance of striking at the enemy's heart. Instead of chasing Hannibal across Italy, Scipio sailed to North Africa, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest commander. Hannibal returned home to face the man shaped by his own teachings. At the Battle of Zama in 200 BCE, Hannibal fought with brilliance, but Scipio fought with experience forged from years of watching Rome bleed. It was Scipio, the student, who finally ended the war, defeating Hannibal and forcing Carthage into surrender. The Republic had survived the man who came closest to destroying it. And yet, Hannibal's legacy endured. Cannae became the gold standard of battlefield tactics. Commanders for centuries studied his double-envelopment: Napoleon, Frederick the Great, even modern generals. The battle demonstrated the devastating power of encirclement, the importance of psychological warfare, and the fatal consequences of pride. Rome, too, was shaped by that day. Their willingness to rise from the ashes of disaster became the foundation of an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. The Republic realized that survival required flexibility, discipline, and unity. Cannae, though a catastrophe, became the crucible that hardened Rome into an unstoppable force. Hannibal had won a battle, unmatched in brilliance. Rome had won the war. The plains of Cannae remained littered with bones. For generations, a grim reminder of the cost of arrogance, the brilliance of Hannibal, and the resilience of Rome. It was said that even decades later, farmers plowing the land, unearthed helmets, broken shields, and the skeletons of men who died standing upright, crushed by the sheer weight of their comrades. Cannae was not just a battle, it was a lesson written in blood, one that changed the course of world history. If the Battle of Cannae teaches us anything, it is this: numbers alone do not decide history. Courage alone does not guarantee victory, and even the strongest empires can crumble in a single afternoon if they dare to underestimate the mind of a genius. Hannibal delivered a masterpiece on the plains of Cannae, one so perfect, so complete, that it is still studied 2,000 years later. But Rome showed the world something just as powerful: the will to rise when everything seems lost. It was a clash not just of armies, but of ideas, one man's brilliance against a nation's unbreakable resolve. And that is why Cannae still matters today. It is a reminder that triumph can turn into disaster in a heartbeat, and disaster can become the spark that forges a new destiny. If you found yourself imagining the dust, the heat, the terror, and the strategy of that fateful day, then this story has done its job. But the ancient world still hides countless battles, heroes, betrayals, and breathtaking moments that shaped our modern lives in ways we rarely notice. So don't stop here. If you want more cinematic history told with accuracy, intensity, and respect for the past, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Tell me in the comments, which ancient battle should we bring to life next? Your suggestion might be the next epic we recreate on screen, because history isn't dead. It waits for those brave enough to uncover it.